Hello everybody, this is Carm Killed the Cat, and welcome to your second Lua 5.2 tutorial. So in the last video, we installed our Lua editor, Zerobrane Studio, and then we created a simple program that just outputs whatever message we give it to the console window down here. So in this video, we'll be writing some more advanced code. We'll be working with variables, and more specifically, we'll be learning how to make a variable. We'll be learning the different types of variables. We'll be learning how to edit variables, and we'll also be learning about the syntax of Lua, which is like programming grammar. So let's get started. So a variable in programming is a lot like a variable in math. It's a way to store and reference a changing value. And you can do a lot more with variables in programming than you can in math. And the first thing we're going to do with variables is learn how to declare them. So this is similar to math as well. You give the variable a name, and then you just have an equal sign, and then you give the variable a value. So this is the full declaration of a variable in Lua. If you're familiar with other programming languages, you don't need to declare the type of the variable. You just give it a name, and Lua will figure out the type for you. And this will become important in the next tutorial. This is called the assignment equals operator. I'll say that again in the next tutorial, but just keep that in mind. So this is what's called a number variable in Lua. It's not an integer, it's a number, and I'll get into that later as well. And it's now an accessible value, so we can print it using the print function here that we went over in the last video. So we can just put x here, and now this will be printable. So we'll save this, and you can actually run programs in Zerobrane just by hitting F6. You don't have to double click the debug button. So you see here we got 10 instead of hello world like it was before. So we printed 10 by giving x to the print function. So x now stores the value 10. So before we go any further, we should get into how to properly name variables. So you see here with our x variable, the x is the name of our variable. And this is considered a valid variable name. It has to be for the program to run. And there are some very specific rules with what is and isn't a valid variable name. The first rule is no spaces. So we can't say number x. That won't run. If we save it and run it, we get an error down here. I don't know if you can read this, but in case you can, it says Lua:1, which means Lua line 1, and it says equals expected near x. And that's not very descriptive, but what it means is it's expecting an equal sign right here. So this isn't a valid variable name because it has a space. Another rule is that you can't have a number at the beginning of the variable name, so we can't say 1x. I'm not actually sure what would happen if we tried to run this. Malformed number near 1x. So it's considering this a number, and you can't just have a variable name right after a number. So that doesn't work either. Oops, deleted the wrong character. Another rule is that you can't have any non-letter or number characters in your variable name. So, well, that's not true. You can have some, but you can't have certain characters in your variable name. So, for example, the plus sign is used to add numbers together, so you can't have that. So you can't say x plus y equals 10. That won't work. It says equals expected near plus. So that's not allowed. But you are allowed to have any just letters or numbers, as long as the number isn't at the beginning of the variable again. You can have any combination of letters and numbers. Also underscores. This is a really weird variable name, but it works. You can also have underscores, and I think that's it. Oh, you can also have this. The thing under the tilde on the keyboard. Oh, no, you can't have that. Never mind, you can't have that. So you can have letters, numbers, and underscores. So this should run again. Actually, no, it won't, because this isn't the correct name anymore. So now we should get the same thing we did before. We get 10. So those are all the specific rules that you have to follow when naming variables, but there are also some rules that are implied and that you just should follow when you're naming your variables. So the first rule is that you should have your variables in some way describe what the variable is going to do. So unless you're describing the x position of something on a coordinate grid, you shouldn't just have x as your variable name. Something more appropriate for this would be, say, example variable. Example variable. Or you could also just have variable or number, anything that describes in general what the variable is going to do in the program. So we can change this as well. So the second rule is that your variable name shouldn't be too lengthy. So instead of example variable, something that would be lengthy would say, I guess, the first variable in the program. So that's a bit too long. It kind of over-explains things, and actually in this case it doesn't explain what the variable does, it just says that it's the first one. So try to keep it short and sweet, but also descriptive. So example variable works just fine. And also feel free to abbreviate words, so example var is fine. Actually I wouldn't do ex var because ex can stand for a bunch of things. But var is a very common abbreviation for variable, so feel free to abbreviate words when you think that you'll be able to understand what it will do later. So we can change this to example var, just to make it the variable name a bit shorter. And that's just so you don't have to type more when you're using the variable later. So the final rule is what to do when there's when there are multiple words in the variable name, like this. So you see what I did is I started the new word var with a capital letter. And this is called camel case. This is the most common convention. So just start each new word in the variable name with a capital letter. Another common thing to do is just to have an underscore between the words. This is fine as well. You can use whichever one you want. These are the two common naming conventions. But yeah, either one works. So I'm going to use camel case, but you can use whichever one you want. And then there are also people that just don't do anything. They just keep all the letters lowercase. They don't capitalize between words or put underscores. And this makes it hard to read, so I highly recommend that you don't do this, but your program will still run if you do. So that's all the rules for variable naming, so now let's move on to something a bit more exciting. So the next thing we're going to go over is the different types of variables. This is a comment, by the way. What a comment does is it tells Lua not to execute the line that the double minus signs are on. The double minus sign marks a comment. So whatever you write on this line, the program will execute as if it didn't exist. So I'll list the variable types out here, and then I'll go over each one in detail. So there are numbers, strings, booleans, tables, functions, threads, user data, and nil. So the first one we'll go over is number. So if you're familiar with any other programming language, a number is like an int, a float, and a double put together. And if you're not familiar with any other programming language, a number just stores any number a computer can handle. So it can be 10 like this, it can be 10.5, it can be 10.5 and a bunch of ones. It probably won't hold all of those up to all of these decimal places, but it'll hold most of them, because a computer can only handle so many decimal places. So the number variable type can just store any number, and you can also declare a number with scientific notation, so you can say 10e5, and if we run this, we get 100,000. And you can also use hexadecimal, so OX, F, A, E. So that should execute and print that in decimal. We get 4014. And if you don't know what hexadecimal is, it's base 16 counting. we'll go over it in more detail in a later tutorial. So that's what a number is. The next type is a string, and we used strings in the last video. A string is just a string of characters put together, so it can be a word, it can have spaces, it can have numbers, it can have symbols. It can pretty much have anything, and pretty much anything on your keyboard and more. The only thing you have to really know about strings is escapes, so you make an escape by typing a backslash, and then there are certain characters you can type that will do special things. So say \n, then we save the program, and we run it. We get the string that we typed in, so hello 1 2 3 4, and then a bunch of symbols, and then we get a new line and then another new line, because print automatically adds a new line. So \n creates a new line. There's also \r, which is carriage return, \t, which is tab, \0, which is null character. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. And then also, if you want to have quotes in your string, you use \quote, because obviously if you have quotes, that'll end the string. So those are strings. The next type is a boolean, and a boolean can only store two values, either true or false. And we'll use these more in the next tutorial. They're used for what's called conditionals. So more on that in the next tutorial. The next type is a table. They're declared with the curly brackets, set brackets in math. And this is the array, the vector, list, table, really any kind of container type. It's that in Lua. You can use it as a matrix. Pretty much it's a variable that stores variables. That's a good way to explain it. A function, we'll get into that in a later tutorial. And yes, functions are variable types in Lua, if you're familiar with another programming language. But if you don't know what a function is, we'll get into that in another tutorial. Don't worry about it. A thread, it's not a true thread. It's what's called a coroutine. I don't know why it's called a thread. But again, we'll get into that in a later tutorial. And user data, we'll get into this in a much later tutorial. It's a way to store raw C data in Lua. So we won't get into this until late in the C library tutorials, which are a long way away. And the final variable type is nil. And a nil type variable can only store one value, and that is nil. So this may seem useless to you, but what nil is used for is it's the default value for all variables. So say we just create a new variable, call it another variable, so another var, and if we tried to print this, in most languages you would get an error. But in Lua, if you can't read this, it says nil. So by default, every possible variable type and every variable name in Lua is set to nil until you set something else to it. So when we set example var to 10, example var is no longer nil, it's now 10. But another var, since we haven't set a value to it, it's still nil. Nil just represents nothing. And we'll get more into nil when we go into tables, because it's important for deallocating memory when you're using tables. But that's all the types in Lua. The next thing we're going to go over are the math operators, and also the Catenation Operator, which we'll get to last. So Lua has all the basic math operations. It has plus, so you can say example var equals 10 plus 1, and if you run this, you get, oh, I still have another var there. Example var, apparently this doesn't autocomplete. But example var, you get 11 down here. I'm still not sure if you can read that. We could say 10 plus 3, just to prove that it works. And we get 13. There's also subtraction with the minus sign. You get 7. There's multiplication. You get 30. Division. You get 3.3 repeating. And you can see here that it stops after a certain number of decimal places. That's the maximum number of decimal places that computers can handle. And programming also gives a new... Oh, 1 second, my dog's barking. Sorry about that. Like I was saying, there is another math operator that is really only ever seen in programming, and that's called the Modulus Operator. And what the Modulus Operator does is it divides these two numbers, so it divides 10 by 3, and then it sets whatever variable you're assigning 10 modulo 3 to, it assigns that variable to the remainder. So 10 divided by 3 is 9 with a remainder of 1. So example var will be set to 1. So if we run this, we get 1 down here. So that's how the modulus operator works. You can also use decimals. You can say 3.3. And, oh, I used the play button again. And you get 0.1. And you can use it with pretty much any number. It just divides the two numbers and then gives you the remainder. So that's all the math operators. The next operator is used on strings, and that's the Catenation Operator. And what this operator does is it just squishes the two strings together into one. So if we have hello and space, and then the Catenation Operator, which is ... and then you have world. And we'll put an exclamation point there to be fun. So hello ... world. So what this does is it pushes the strings together into one string that just says hello space world. So if we save it, run it, we get hello world just like in the last tutorial. But we got it from two separate strings. So that's all the basic operators that we can use so far. We'll get to more in the next tutorial with conditionals, but don't worry about that yet. We'll get to that next. So that's all for this tutorial. I was going to go over some basic syntax rules, but I ran out of time to record, so we'll have to do that next tutorial. It'll be of more use to in the next tutorial as well, so maybe that's a good thing. But like I've said before, in the next tutorial we'll be going over conditionals, which is the Boolean operators and if statements. So see you in the next video.